It is staying mild, temperatures at lowest probably around 5 to 6 degrees in the north. So that rain will continue to work its way eastwards as we move into Monday morning. It starts to weaken a little bit as it heads towards southeast England, so not a lot of rain left on it here. And then behind it, lots of sunshine around. A few showers in places, but I think for most it's going to be a decent day until some further cloud and rain arrives later up towards the far northwest of Scotland.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment, and the bureaucracy, and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police, and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows that he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under, and of course the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force, and clearly a problem with the Home Secretary, who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. It's wet, it's windy. Grab yourself a cuppa, don't go anywhere because we've got a fun-packed 90 minutes ahead. It's been another very busy week in Westminster. Labour has managed to secure 2 new MPs with big wins in this week's by-elections. Is Sir Keir Starmer on his way to number 10? I'll be asking Shadow Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds for his thoughts on this and the forthcoming Rochdale by-election, which Labour has suspended its candidate for. I'll be grilling the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson. Can Rishi Sunak really stop the boats? And with reform on the rise, do the Tories have a hope of winning the next general election? Will it be in May or will it be in the autumn? We'll be discussing that too. I'll also be speaking to former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the Tory MP whose house was targeted this week by pro-Palestinian protesters. He'll be joining us live from the Munich Security Conference. As news broke of Putin's political opponent Alexei Navalny's death this week, I'll be joined by former British ambassador to Russia, Sir Andrew Wood, to find out what he makes of Foreign Secretary David Cameron's claim that there should be consequences for the Russian president. I'll also be joined by former Scotland Yard top cop David Murray-Gilbertson as we get to grips with whether the boys and girls in blue have lost their way. And the People's Panel is back. We are in Nottingham today, and as ever, we want to hear from you, our loyal GB viewers, and we want you to have your say. Right, let's get stuck into the Sunday morning papers. I'm delighted to be joined now by senior news political commentator Nigel Nelson with GB News, formerly of The Mirror and The People. Nigel, lovely to see you this morning. Let's start with Storm in Starmer as we're headlining it, because he's made a bit of an intervention at the Munich Security Conference. It's been interpreted by the Sunday Telegraph as a sort of slight on Donald Trump making that point about NATO defence spending. How do you interpret it? I mean, he's been over in Munich trying to look very prime ministerial.
Yeah, well, that's the point of going there, to actually show that he's there on the world stage, that he's about to be prime minister, and so he needs to meet foreign leaders. He doesn't actually mention Trump in this particular in the article he's being quoted in. But what he's talking about is that people should actually pull together. So the issue at the moment is that Trump is saying, well, going rather over the top by saying, if NATO members don't stump up the 2% that they're meant to, then Russia can go and invade them. It seems to be the paraphrase he's using.
I mean, the second half of that seems a bit OTT, but the first half of it is a fair point, isn't it? I note as well in the Sunday Telegraph that, lo and behold, he's not even in power, and yet Trump is pushing the dial because a load of these European countries are now scrambling to make their 2% pledge because they don't want to look like they've got egg on their face if he becomes the next US president.
And I think that when Trump was president and made these comments by saying, look, everyone's got to actually stump up the money that they agreed in 2014. And back then, it was only the US, UK and Greece that actually were stumping up the money. Now, 11 NATO members are doing it, but you've still got a membership of 31. And Germany, for instance, won't be able to get their money in place until 2031.
I mean, it's interesting, this intervention. He hasn't mentioned Trump, but, you know, everybody knows what he means. His shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has been pretty robust in his criticism of Trump in the past. So have other members of the Labour Party. It's going to be a bit tricky, isn't it, if he's PM and Donald Trump is president?
It'll be tricky, but I mean, again, I think that Keir Starmer at some point will have to make a visit to America. But what he's also saying in this piece in the Telegraph is that he'll work with whoever is elected president. He's doing this sort of thing, the usual politician thing of not interfering with somebody else's election.
Although, is he being a little bit too complacent? He's released this slick video this morning looking very prime ministerial. There's a warning from David Blunkett in the Mail on Sunday today. Call me a party pooper, but Sir Keir Starmer must not take victory for granted. I mean, they've won these by-elections, but, you know, we haven't actually had a national vote. I appreciate what the polls are saying, but isn't it more about Tory apathy than Labour success?
Yes, certainly. I mean, both in Kingswood and Wellingborough, it's Tory voters mostly staying at home because they're just fed up with the Tory party. What David Blunkett says on the Mail on Sunday is that he's looking back not to the last few elections. He goes right back to 1964. And what he's saying...
Which you remember clearly, Nigel. Only joking, Nigel.
Yes, I think it was in Nappers at that stage. So he's going back to 64. And what he says is, it's a similar situation, Tories in complete chaos. Labour looked like they were going to get an absolute landslide and ended up with just a majority of 4.
Yeah, Theresa May would have been happy with that.
Well, that's right, yes.
So that's a good point, isn't it? You know, this idea that they're already in power, I mean, needs to be avoided. Let's just move on as well to what the by-elections seem to be suggesting in terms of the timing of the next election. I can't really believe this, but the Mirror says the Tories are eyeing a May vote. Are they kamikaze? And Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday is also saying that the unpalatable truth is the longer Rishi waits to call an election, the worse it will be for the Tories. May election? Have they gone mad, Nigel?
Well, I think that they've been laying the groundwork for a May election since last year. What Mikey Smith is saying in the Sunday Mirror is that the reason they're thinking about it again is because they don't think that Rishi Sunak can last until the autumn, because his own MPs might topple them. Dan is saying things aren't going to get any better, so you might as well go now. I mean, what they were doing was that back in November, the first thing was national insurance tax cuts. Now, what that did was they rushed that through in January, idea being you'd have 3 months in your pay packets until May.
Yeah, bedding in that economic benefit.
Then there was the promise to get the boats off.
Yeah.
And there were also, Whitehall officials were quietly talking to local authorities that weren't having elections on May the 2nd to see what the availability of their polling stations was.
Yeah.
So, given that, the only reason you could be doing that is you're thinking we might go for May. As things have got worse, now we're in recession, the polls are not closing, Rwanda is probably not going to work for some months anyway, even if it ever works at all. As a result of that, it makes a May election look less likely. We'll see. They may just cut and run and say, look, let's just do it.
Extraordinary stuff. Let's talk about the Farage factor quickly. Tories already fear reform. If Farage were his leader, they'd be truly terrified. I mean, that's in the Sunday Times. I think it's a pretty accurate assessment, isn't it? It's interesting to see reform doing that well without Nigel Farage in an official role. I appreciate he is in that honorary chairmanship role, and also without the name recognition that UKIP had.
Yes, and I mean, Nigel keeps teasing us about what he's actually going to do. We still don't know whether he's going to really get stuck into the election.
Do you want to know what I think he's going to do?
Go on.
Dive bomb in about 8 weeks before the election.
Could be. That's what the Tories are terrified of, the idea that it will be hit 2 months before. But some really interesting figures they come up with, that given that they got 13%, Reform got 13% of the vote in Wellingborough, which is about the same, a little bit more than UKIP got back in 2015. So they had 4 million votes in 2015, only one MP, but even so. The figures that the Sunday Times have come out with is the damage they could cause to the Tories. So at 10% of the vote, the Tories lose 39 seats, 12% 47 seats, 15% 63. So they are a significant. If when the polls narrow towards the election, and we are just looking a lot closer, they could be the major player.
But the Farage factor, I think, puts up the predicted vote share to around that 17% mark, which is obviously like cataclysmic for the Tories. We will watch that with great interest and await Mr Farage's announcement when it comes. Let's just have a quick chat before we finish about the royals, because there's a couple of really interesting stories. First of all, that Prince William is building this social housing in Cornwall as part of his remit as the Duke of Cornwall. He's in charge now of the Duchy of Cornwall. But equally, there's this other story about how William will not allow Harry back into the family. First of all, I mean, in your previous sort of Mirror/People guys, the papers were very much against the monarchy. Isn't an initiative like this, William building social housing, likely to impress the left?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I am impressed that my position has been previously that I'm not a royalist, but I'm a monarchist. And I do think that it's things like this, where they connect with the people, that is exactly what William should be doing. On the second point about Prince Harry, what Prince Harry has offered is he'll come back and do a few duties while his father is ill.
Yes.
William is saying...
That's good of him, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, yeah, whatever those duties might be, but... William is saying, no way. I mean, according to briefings to the Sunday Express and Sunday Mirror, he says, look, we're just not going to have him. He's not coming back. I think that's probably right, that here you've got Harry, who abandoned the working royal rota. He then slagged off his family, first on television, then in a book. It would be a bit difficult to actually bring him back, even in a kind of locum role.
I know, but I think it's really intriguing that this has sort of been briefed into the Sunday papers, in the sense that I mean, we saw him in Whistler in Canada with Meghan sort of promoting the Invictus Games. He was, according to a colleague, sort of came over and thanked the press for being there, which I thought was quite extraordinary.
Unusual.
And then they've relaunched this website featuring Meghan's royal coat of arms and very much referring to themselves in a royal sense using their titles. Is it that he is now dabbling with the idea of coming back to royal life because they've realised that it's their royal connections that give them meaning?
Well, I would have thought that it's only their royal connections that give them money, because that's why they don't want to get rid of titles and so on.
But that wasn't as part of the Sandringham summit. They were told in explicit terms by the late Queen and indeed at the time Prince Charles that they weren't to be cashing in on these royal connections.
But they did.
They weren't to be using these coats of arms and other matters.
But they did.
Yeah.
But at the moment it seems to be that they're a long way from being able to come back for a full kind of reconciliation. Personally, I'd like to see a reconciliation between Harry and the rest of the family. I know, that's me. Doesn't mean he has to do royal duties, though.
No, I think royal duties might be a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
Nigel Nelson, thank you for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Now, Will Hollis is in Nottingham with our People's panel this morning. Will, what's tying the people in knots in knots?
Good morning. Yes, well, we're live from Nottingham in the fantastic Brate's coffee shop. They've let us in early this morning because you can't talk politics without hearing from the ordinary people. But my panel today, Camilla, are anything but ordinary. They're extraordinary, aren't they? We've got Michael McKeever, who's a retired head teacher from Nottingham. We've got Catherine Bohm, who is an independent councillor as well as a landlady in nearby Eastwood. And we've got Jeff Hampson. You're a veteran and you're also a veteran support worker. We've got time for one question, guys. We've got all the politicians on Camilla's programme this morning. Michael, a retired head teacher, what might you like to hear from our shadow ministers and government ministers today?
I'd like to ask them what the strategy is to support public service in this country, especially schools, which are in crisis financially and in terms of recruitment.
Big problems with recruitment. Michael, don't go anywhere. Catherine, what might you like to hear from our politicians today?
Well, a lot of people are talking about illegal migration. What are we going to do about it? I'm a realist, not a racist, so let's find out what's happening.
Well, we've got the illegal migration minister on today, so it's the perfect time to ask that question. And Jeff, what do you think? A veteran support worker, what might you like to ask our politicians this morning?
Right, well, we have approximately 7,000 homeless veterans living on the streets, many with PTSD, who are getting no help from the government whatsoever. They can find the funds to house immigrants, but they cannot find the funds to help to take veterans off the streets.
So you'd like to hear from, what question might you like to ask Jeff?
What is the government going to do about it?
Jeff, thank you. Guys, we're not going anywhere. We've got a fantastic coffee shop and fantastic coffee. We've got the programme on as well in the corner. So come back to us in a little bit and we'll have plenty more to say about the politics this morning, Camilla.
Great to hear. Thank you very much to Will and our People's panel in Nottingham. Now, don't go anywhere because in just a few minutes I'll be speaking to the former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, after his house was targeted this week by pro-Palestinian protesters. He'll be joining us live from the Munich Security Conference in just a moment. In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World. Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. I'm joined now by former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the MP for Bournemouth East. Tobias, thank you for joining me from Munich. First of all, I have to ask you, how are you and your family? What a dreadful series of events you had to endure last week from these pro-Palestinian protesters effectively gathering in a mob outside your home.
Yeah, it was very surprising on a number of accounts to be told by the police, give them fair gratitude. They were able to see on the internet that an event was going to take place outside my house, warned me off to go there. But you don't expect this sort of behavior in today's day and age, and we need to make sure it does not become the norm. I think MPs, I expect a bit of rough and tumble. They expect criticism publicly and so forth. But when it comes to your house, you'd hope that there would be a line drawn on what is acceptable behaviour. And I'm very grateful to Tom Tugendhat, the security minister, and Chris Felt, the policing minister, to ask the police to look at the current laws to see whether they need to be improved. Because otherwise, it's not just the impact on families and so forth. It's also the next generation of parliamentarians, the people that we'd like to step forward into public life. More people would be put off by wanting to become an MP if we don't recognise some standards of which behaviour in demonstrations is allowed to operate.
I mean, I totally agree with that, and I see that you have praised Dorset Police for giving you advance warning so you didn't go back to your home. Although, have any arrests been made of those who descended on your property?
So this was very much a live conversation that evening. They had a series of police cars that were protecting my property, an armed response unit there as well to watch activity. Don't forget that when these demonstrations take place, which are very intensive and dozens of people there, they almost want arrests to take place. They want to ratchet things up. And it was a view of the police on the ground to allow this to sort of fizzle out. They were there for 3.5 hours. They then dispersed. Imagine the number of police required to move them on or to sort of make arrests and so forth. Dorset Police made, I think, the right decision at this time. The bigger question, though, is...
I think we've just had Tobias Ellwood frozen there. Let's bring Nigel Nelson back into the conversation while we try and get Tobias's link back up. This is unfortunately the peril of speaking to somebody at the Munich Security Conference.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I mean, can't quite understand how it's now carte blanche for protesters to just descend on the home of MPs. It's not just Tobias Ellwood. We've seen this happen to Wes Streeting. We've had Mike Freer now, the MP for Golders Green, announce that he's got to step down. The threats to him are too much. I had Suella Braverman in this chair a couple of weeks ago telling me that she has had to hold on to her taxpayer-funded bodyguards that she had while she was Home Secretary. Normally, you don't keep them. You go off back into your normal constituency life and you don't need that protection. She does, because she keeps on receiving death threats. I mean, in my mind, it's extraordinary that the police have to tell an MP he can't go back to his home.
Yes, it is extraordinary. And bear in mind, Rishi Sunak also had his home attacked. No, it's not acceptable. I mean, certainly protests outside Parliament, that's the place for them.
I think we've got Tobias back. Sorry to interrupt, Nigel. Tobias, hopefully you can hear me again. Sorry, we just lost that link. Look, we've dealt with this issue with the police. Let's talk about the Munich Security Conference you're attending now. The reaction, quite understandably, to Alexei Navalny's death has been that of shock and horror. We've heard the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, talk about consequences for the Russian president. What consequences would you like to see?
Well, we simply just need to recognise how contested, how fragmented our world is becoming. And what President Putin is doing is a great example of that, of crushing opposition, of any criticism in his own country, but the wider intentions of what he wants to do, not just in Ukraine, but beyond. And the big debate here is, how do we then manage that? A world that's becoming ever more contested, more fragmented. What is the West doing about it? And the shadow of Trump was here, really was quite... I think a test of the West, indeed the American senators that were all here, because, of course, they're tying in their support for Ukraine with domestic issues to do with the Mexican border. And people in Europe here just simply don't get that. If we don't provide Ukraine the necessary assets, the military equipment that they need to actually take back their territory, then Putin will not stop there. We need to make that clear, that Europe is at war right now, and it will continue and gets worse unless we put this fire out.
I mean, I understand, Tobias, that you wouldn't be agreeing with Trump when it comes to, obviously, this $9 billion aid package, which the Republicans are blocking going to Ukraine. But at the same time, you must side with him when he calls for all of these NATO countries to honour this 2% of defence spending. We've heard Keir Starmer in the Sunday Telegraph sort of question that and say, you know, that he's being divisive and all the rest of it. But come on, I mean, these countries have to step up the cash, don't they?
They do indeed, but you don't do that with your allies by telling Putin to invade a NATO ally. That is not the way forward. And don't forget also that Trump, whilst he was president, actually threatened to pull out of NATO and then pivot to China. That America must understand that if Europe goes back into any form of conflict, larger conflict beyond Ukraine, it will have a knock-on economic consequence to America as well, and cost us more in the long term as well. That's why we need to get this right. That's why we need to focus on supporting Ukraine. And, for their own British defence budget as well. It isn't just Ukraine. We see the Middle East as well. There are complexity of issues. We've entered a new era of insecurity. We are still on a peacetime budget. And we know that our Army, our Air Force and our Navy aren't currently overstretched. So some big questions for Britain as well.
Let's bring it back to domestic matters. I've got Jeff on my People's panel in Nottinghamshire today. He's a former military gentleman, and he's basically talking about the number of homeless veterans, 7,000 he claims, many of whom are dealing with PTSD. He says, why aren't the government doing more to help them?
Well, there are many programs to support those. There's the Armed Forces Covenant, which actually obliges all councils up and down the country to make sure that those who have served their country with pride are then given the necessary support they need, particularly if they've got mental health challenges such as PTSD. So I'm sure if we get those details of where your panel were referencing, either myself or certainly you've got Johnny Mercer, who's been so focused on this, so dedicated on this, on making sure that we get the money through to the front line to support our valiant veterans.
OK, some interesting polling in the Sunday Telegraph today suggesting that 70%, Tobias, of Tory voters think it was wrong to ditch Boris Johnson.
Well, we've moved on from that. He's not even MP there, so it's actually a bit of a distraction as to where we need to go. General election is only months away. What are they suggesting? That somehow he then, somebody gives up their seat? he comes back in. My goodness, how disturbing that would be for the Conservative Party to then have another turn of the wheel, another selection process. Really, I think we need to recognise why he departed, why he had to go in the manner that he did. We now have a Prime Minister. Let's back the current Prime Minister.
OK, but unfortunately, the country doesn't seem to be backing him. He hasn't pushed the dial any further forward in his favour since announcing his 5-point plan. The plan doesn't seem to be working. I mean, you're very much a centrist Tory. You talk about the importance of the broad church. How's that congregation going? Because the last time I checked, you've lost 2 by-elections and you're 20 points behind in the poll.
Yeah, and that's simply because we're not getting the airtime for people like you to scrutinise what Labour are doing, because we're spending the whole time having a bun fight with each other. And you go back, if I may, go back to the centre ground. The centre ground in British politics, the floating voter, that's how you win elections. When you go to extremes, onto the right or to the left, you will not win the general election. Jeremy Corbyn proved that when he was leader. And what we need to do is recognise the big grandees. We've had this conversation before. The big grandees, the big beasts who've won elections have gone for the centre ground. That's where the winning streak should be.
You're getting killed on the right, Tobias. At the end of the day, might the Tories have to entertain a deal with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party?
OK, so it takes you even further to the extreme, gifting that space to Labour, to the centre ground to Labour, and then they will actually then win. This is a false strategy. It really, really is.
All right, Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much indeed for joining me from Munich. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Lots more to come in the next hour. I'm going to be joined by the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson. I'll also be speaking to the Shadow Minister, Nick Tommen-Simmons. What do both men make of the rise of reform? Don't go anywhere.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Marnie says being sexy in business is entirely possible and maybe even better.
Well, Marnie, this is something I say is true. I've had to live with this for quite a long time. And I think you can do both. Now, tell me, it's lovely to see you, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
In all your gorgeousness. And you're telling me that often is regarded as something derogatory or something to hold you back. Is that right?
It's just this really unfair thing, this really unfair narrative that women can't do both. Even men can do it. As you know, Eamon, you can do it. You can do it all. And I just think, women are so multifaceted. They can be mothers, they can be sexy, they can be businesswomen, they can be silly, they can be all these different dimensions. And this press push that we have to limit ourselves to one category, it's just unfair.
But do you think that is where some people may be wrong-footed or go wrong to underestimate you?
Exactly. There is that saying, disarm with charm. So, that there is that idea that people do look at someone who cares about how they look, who's perhaps a bit feminine, and underestimate them. But hopefully I proved that wasn't the case in the boardroom.
And thank goodness for Karen Brady. She's definitely upped the glam stakes on the show. And if anybody can prove that you can be sexy and successful in business, I suppose it's her, really. But where do you think most of the criticism comes from? Because I have to say, hard to believe, but when I was younger, I certainly got a bit of this at my old employer, being told that I had to dress a certain way, not to be too sexy, which I found hugely
you were told this by women.
I was told this by a female boss who didn't like me wearing zips on the back of my dress. Not just me, but some of the other presenters there. And I took such offence. I felt like she thought that I was some sort of, I don't know what. Do you take offence when people are criticising you that, in some way they think you're, I don't know?
There's just no right answer. And as we said, I think Karen Brady is doing an excellent job at leading the charge that you can be glamorous and get the job done.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Much more to come in the next hour. We've got the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson, and I'll be speaking to the Shadow Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds. Are Labour on a path to Downing Street victory following this week's by-election results? But first, here's the news with Sophia Wensler.
Thanks, Camilla. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Your top story this hour. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands as he pushed Republicans to urgently pass more military aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. Former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine needs more support.
Loss of Avdiivka is significant. The Ukrainians have been holding on to that since 2014 and fighting the Russians. But they've made the sensible military decision not to sacrifice any more of their troops to keep this completely decimated piece of territory. The Russians are making some advances from a one-dimensional perspective on the front line, but these advances are tiny at the moment, and it's purely because Russia has got more ammunition from North Korea and from Iran. And the Ukrainians are suffering a shortage of ammunition coming from the West.
More than 400 people have been detained at an event across 32 Russian cities since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. It's the biggest wave of political unrest since September 2022, when more than 1,300 were arrested for protesting against forced military service, part of President Putin's effort to cover heavy casualties endured in Ukraine. Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny. Meanwhile, authorities have been accused of doing everything they can to avoid handing over Mr. Navalny's body to his family. The 69-year-old mother of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic visited the remote penal colony where he died yesterday, where temperatures were minus 30 degrees. She says she was told his body had been taken to a nearby morgue, but when she arrived there, she found it closed. Mr. Navalny's spokespeople claim his death was orchestrated murder by the Russian president. That's been rejected by the Kremlin. And Ukrainian refugees will be offered an 18-month visa extension to stay in the UK. It means Ukrainians who had to flee their home after Russia's invasion in 2022 will be able to stay in Britain until at least September 2026. The first visas, which granted Ukrainian people sanctuary in the UK, are set to expire in March 2025. More than 283,000 Ukrainians have been offered an extended sanctuary since the beginning of the invasion on the 24th of February 2022. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Camilla.
Thanks for that, Sophia. We've got a lot to come in the next 60 minutes, so let's just run through who we've got coming up. In just a minute, I'm going to be joined by Shadow Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds. I'll be asking him what the by-election results mean for Labour. I'll also be speaking to the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson. He's the man charged with stopping the boats. I want to know what his plan actually is, not least because reportedly he criticised the Rwanda plan before taking up his current ministerial position. I'm also going to be joined by Sir Andrew Wood, the former British ambassador to Russia, who will tell us what part Putin had to play in the death of his political opponent Alexei Navalny this week. Former Scotland Yard Deputy Assistant Commissioner David Murray-Gilbertson will be sharing his thoughts on the state of the British police, and he'll have some home truths to share from his time on the force. And we're going to be getting the verdict live from our People's Panel in Nottingham. But first of all, let's now speak to Shadow Minister without portfolio, Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Labour MP for Torfaen. Nice to see you, Nick. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. We're going to allow you to have a good old crow about the by-election results in just a minute. But can we just look forward again to Rochdale next week? Because you were dragged onto the airwaves to defend Azhar Ali last week. And I'm wondering whether you regret that now, considering what we now know? I mean, I can't really understand why you felt you could defend him when he had said the indefensible about Israel, but do you now regret it?
Look, I couldn't have and didn't know what subsequently came out later that day, but...
Wasn't what he said enough to condemn him?
Well, what he said was appalling, and I made that absolutely clear when I was speaking about this on Monday. But what I and we had listened to were hugely respected, prominent people in the Jewish community who spoke about the history that candidate, former candidate, now had in actually standing beside people against anti-Semitic attacks, and had also given what appeared to be a genuine full apology and a recognition of rebuilding bridges. But the assessment that we were given that this was out of character, as soon as it became clear that there was another incident, this wasn't out of character, then clearly the very difficult decision had to be taken. And I say difficult, Camilla, because it's a huge decision to have a by-election with no supported Labour candidate, which is what we have. But
well, I know, but you didn't do your due diligence on vetting him, did you? I mean, most people saw the situation last week. I spoke to Pat McFadden, a colleague of yours. You know, he's a very straight-talking, sort of no-nonsense type of politician. He's there defending this guy. Everyone else is watching and listening to the programme thinking, how could you even... he should have been sacked immediately. He was basically peddling sort of conspiracy theories that the Israelis brought the October the 7th attack on themselves so that they could attack Gaza. I mean, it's the stuff of sort of Twitter lunacy.
It's appalling, and I made that clear, as did Pat McFadden last week. It was the point that we were told this was something that was out of character. As soon as it became clear there was another incident, the decision had to be taken. But Camilla, this was a decision taken over 48 hours. We're talking about a matter of hours here. That decision has firmly been taken. And there is no doubt that there is a real change that's been led by Keir Starmer dealing with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And it's not just taking my word for it. That's what the EHRC has said by taking the Labour Party out of special measures last year in recognition of the changes Keir Starmer has made to our systems.
Although you're not all singing from the same hymn sheet, are you? Because we understand that the SNP has tabled a motion calling for a ceasefire. They want to call for a second vote in the House of Commons. On one hand, we've got Keir Starmer resisting that, and on the other, we now have Scottish Labour saying that they support the motion. They think it's perfectly reasonable. So actually, Labour is split on a ceasefire.
We're completely united about seeing an end to the fighting.
But you're not united on a ceasefire, are you?
Well, we all want to get to a ceasefire. What we are saying...
Will you vote for one, then?
Well, look, we will need to look at the wording of the motion that is actually laid before Parliament.
Have you not seen the motion? It's already out.
Well, we need to see what the laid motion is. You see various things going around on social media. Let's see it formally laid down, actually what the final wording is. Let me just explain the position that we take on this, because we all want to see an end to the fighting. But we want to build a sustainable ceasefire that is going to last. And what that means is an end to the fighting on both sides, so rockets coming out of Gaza as well as going into Gaza. It means releasing the hostages, absolutely vital. It means getting that humanitarian aid into Gaza that is desperately needed. But it also means trying to put steps into place to move towards a two-state solution, which the international community has put in the too difficult box for too long. These are the steps that we actually need to take to get to that sustainable ceasefire.
OK. I mean, you used to be a former Shadow Home Secretary, so you'll have an insight into Sir Keir Starmer's thinking when it comes to talking about our own national security. What's he saying, however, when he's at the Munich Security Conference yesterday, talking about standing up for allies in NATO? OK, that speaks for itself. But then warning against divide and threatening behaviour. Is he referring to Donald Trump there? I mean, does he not agree with Donald Trump that our European neighbours should be honouring their 2% defence spending commitments?
Well, look, certainly people need to be honouring their defence commitments, but I agree with what the NATO Secretary-General has said about this, and indeed Keir has said around the idea of inviting or pressing Russia to attack NATO allies. That clearly isn't in line with Article 5, and anything that undermines Article 5, the idea that we all stand together, is obviously not helpful. But at the same time, Camilla, I would say that it is a matter for the American people who they choose to elect as their president in November. Whoever is elected as the president, if there is to be a Labour government, and we are privileged to serve, we will work with whoever that president is. Because, frankly, the special relationship with the United States, it's between people. It doesn't depend upon who the president and prime minister is at any given time.
What do you think of Donald Trump?
I think that's for the American people.
No, everyone can have an opinion. What's your opinion?
Well, I don't. On that particular issue that you've asked me around about NATO, I've said that I think trying to undermine the alliance is the wrong thing to do. Broadly speaking, it's a matter for the American people what their view is. It's for them.
I know, but you must have a view. You might need to be working up close and personal with President Trump and his administration. So what do you think of him as a world leader?
Well, look, our sister party is obviously the Democrats. But let me just say, I was actually in Washington, Camilla, back last year. I was back in Washington in July. What I've always done, what David Lammy always does, what Keir Starmer always does, is you meet people on both sides of the political divide. I was in Congress, for example, last July. I was speaking to Democrats. I was speaking to Republicans as well. And what I always say, and I've said it directly to them, by the way, not just on your show, whoever they choose to select as their presidential candidate and whoever becomes the president is a matter for them. Of course, you can have historical debates about who've been good presidents, bad presidents, and all the rest of it, but that's for the future. What we have to focus on here is the national interest, and the national interest is in working with whoever the American president is after, it'll be January, of course, if there's to be a new president.
Well, on the national interest, Keir Starmer has recorded a shiny new video this morning in which he talks about defence and security being Labour's #1 priority. But it's not the #1 priority of Labour voters, is it? According to Ipsos Mori, more important to Labour voters are the following topics: health, inflation, economy, education, housing. So why is something Labour's #1 priority that isn't actually Labour voters' #1 priority?
Well, because all the things that you've just described can only be achieved if fundamentally you are keeping the country safe. So it's, if you like, what you do as the bedrock upon which all those other things are built. So, keeping the country safe is always the government's #1 priority, has to be a government's #1 priority. And that gives you then the security. You have to build economic stability upon that, which, of course, this government has noticeably failed to do in recent years. That then is the stability that allows you to grow the economy, to give people the public services that they rightly demand.
Some of the coverage of the by-election results are quite interesting this morning. I mean, it's not sort of undiluted praise for Sir Keir Starmer. We've got David Blunkett writing in the Mail on Sunday, warning the Labour leader not to be complacent. We've got a 2-page spread in The Observer, which, let's face it, is no fan of the Tory party, again saying that Labour mustn't be complacent. It's not quite the victory that you're making out, is it? Because it's not really a ringing endorsement for Keir Starmer. It's more a non-endorsement for the Tory government, isn't it? It's about Tory voters staying at home, but they're not flocking to you.
Well, I think in by-elections, I mean, the two turnouts here are about 37%, I think, in Kingswood, 38% in Wellingborough. But when you see lower turnout, it tends to have been across all areas of voters. So I don't think it's fair to assume that exclusively all the votes who stayed at home are Conservative, because the evidence wouldn't suggest that's the case. But these are
So you're saying Labour voters also stayed at home? That's hardly a ringing endorsement of Starmer, is it?
Well, no. This has just been the tradition of by-elections for a number of decades now. 37%.
Well, Tony Blair got people out, didn't he?
No, if you look at turnouts in by-elections, it was lower than in general elections. And interestingly, you're talking about Tony Blair 1995, 96, 97. The point that you've just put to me about it being a verdict on the government but not enthusiastic about Labour was said at the same time in the 1990s. It's not an uncommon argument that's been put. But let me just say this. I was out in Kingswood. That was the place I went there. I visited 3 times in the last 7 days of the campaign. And the candidate there, Damien Egan, now, of course, the Member of Parliament, was campaigning very strongly on our positive offer on the National Health Service, around things like the 2 million new appointments, 700,000 urgent dental appointments, doubling the number of scanners. That positive offer was going down extremely well on the doorstep. So that was very, very important to our campaigns. But it's also the case that people will only put their trust in you if they trust you with the economy and they trust you with the topic we were discussing a moment or two ago, national security. And they are very significant changes. And that's why across the elections, we've seen such large swings. I think it was over 16% in Kingswood, over 28% in Wellingborough. They are huge swings historically to having by-elections to the party.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, we need to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Thank you. Now, as we referenced the Rochdale Labour by-election candidate Azhar Ali, here are the other listed candidates for the upcoming by-election. I'm going to whiz through them very quickly. Azhar Ali was Labour Party, is now independent. Mark Coleman is the independent. Simon Danshut, remember him, he's for Reform UK. Ian Donaldson is the Liberal Democrat. Paul Ellison is the Conservative. George Galloway, again a blast from the past, Workers' Party of Britain. Michael Howarth, independent. William Howarth, independent. Guy Otten, Green Party. Raven Rodent Subaltern, official monster raving loony, and David Tully, the independent. Now, don't move a muscle, because in just a minute, Sir Andrew Wood will join me and I'll be grilling Michael Tomlinson, the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, which I know is important to you. You want to hear the answers to my questions to that. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, weekdays from 9 p.m.
So a new poll has revealed that Gen Z or Gen Z, I don't know how I'm supposed to say it, and British boys and men are more likely to believe that feminism has done more harm than good when compared with older respondents. So the polling also found that a quarter of UK males aged 16 to 29 believe it's harder to be a man than a woman, with 1 in 5 looking favourably upon controversial influencer Andrew Tate. 37% of them also agree that the phrase toxic masculinity is unhelpful. So, with Gen Z boys increasingly holding this view, has feminism done more harm than good? Let me know your thoughts. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com, tweet me @gbnews, and make sure you take part in our poll. But I'll bring you those results shortly. Going head-to-head on this tonight are author and commentator Anna May Mangan and YouTuber and social media influencer Pearl Davies. Both of you, thank you very much. Pearl, I'll start with you. Has feminism done more harm than good, especially when it comes to these Gen Z boys?
Yes, it has. Feminism really has turned into a bunch of crybaby women that want to complain that we're not given equal opportunity, when really women are given more opportunity than men. And so, yeah, I would say feminism is a hate group and it's a bunch of crybaby women.
Anna, would you like to come back to that? Crybaby women feminism, apparently.
So we've got a right lad with us tonight with Pearl and her opinions, haven't we? How could it possibly do harm? Pearl wouldn't do. I hope you vote. I assume you do. I hope you're not chained to the kitchen sink at home. I'm not sure if you've got a job, so I don't know very much about you, but you're probably, if there's a bloke doing the same thing as you, you're probably earning less than him. So of course feminism is something that it got us the vote in the first place, and it's still doing a power of good. It's just whingy men, and actually I changed that. They're lads, they're not men.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. I'm delighted to be joined now by Sir Andrew Wood, former British ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000. You've said I can call you Andrew, so we'll drop the sir and be familiar, Andrew. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Now, Alexei Navalny's family have reacted to his death by saying it's orchestrated murder. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, and it's not the first time, and it won't be the last.
I know when you were in office, you met Putin a couple of times. Tell us what he's actually like.
Well, at the time, he was. We were talking about the possibility of his meeting with Tony Blair, and more immediately, the way that the war in Chechnya was then going, which is an extremely brutal war on the part of the Russians, but it was also one which attracted support for him as a future president. I didn't myself get a judgment as to whether he's a good man or a bad man, but we would see.
Yes, the jury was out at that point, but now 25 years on, from having first met him as Prime Minister to now, I mean, what's your assessment of where he is at? In the sense, not only in the context of Ukraine, but obviously now the sudden death of Navalny. You could say that that was inevitably always going to happen. However, it does sort of move the dial really on, I suppose, the degree to which he isn't willing to stop.
He is not willing to stop, and in my eyes, he's defined himself as essentially a traitor to Russian interests. Russia itself and the Russian people aren't habitual killers and persuaded that the whole purpose of their life is to offend and attack others. But the fact is that he himself is stimulated by fear as being the right policy to introduce to other people. And he also himself, I think, suffers from fear because he's locked himself into a particularly vicious set of policies, and rather futile ones too.
I mean, you obviously got to know the Russian population very, very well in your time there. We've heard from Navalny's widow, Yulia, saying that she wants to continue his work. We've obviously seen protesters come out in support of Navalny on the streets of Moscow. There's been hundreds of arrests. What likelihood is there of there being an uprising among the Russian people in response to this death?
In direct response to his death, I do not think there is going to be such a reaction. It does touch on the proper feelings of large numbers of Russians. But at the same time, as I said earlier, this is not the first person he's killed. My very good friend Nemtsov was killed outside the Kremlin, and so on and so forth. They know that this is the way he acts, and they also are stuck with the immediate difficulty of how to react in the context of the war against Ukraine. Plus the fact is that there's no one else to replace him.
Are you worried about the prospect of a second Trump presidency in light of his relationship with Russia?
Well, I'm not a fan of his, so the answer is yes. But he's a changeable sort of person, and he has also, in his previous presidency, done some quite brave things and good things in the context that he was in. So I think you can't tell.
And when the Foreign Secretary David Cameron talks about consequences for Russia, look, we know that there have been sanctions, we know that Russian assets have been seized. Does it actually make any difference to Putin? I mean, what consequences can there possibly be for the Russian president, in your mind?
I don't think direct consequences, but the fact that he's losing a grip on public opinion in other countries abroad is important. The fact that he is doing his best to hide what has happened to Navalny and the way it has happened in Russia itself is indicative. He's trying to put it as something which happened, wasn't his fault, because nothing ever is, and he will hope it simply disappears in terms of the Russian electorate. And that might be right. He's bound to win when it comes to later this year, in March, because the system is so constructed.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, the timing of Navalny's death and, as you say, these forthcoming elections, which I think we can suggest now fairly plainly aren't going to be free and fair. Another question for you as a former ambassador, Andrew. I mean, where do you think, when it comes to looking at the Western world, the biggest threat is coming from? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it Iran? What's your assessment of the state of things at the moment?
Well, the immediate trigger is more likely, I think, to be Iran or the general chaos that's going on there, because we've got rather used to what's going on in Ukraine. I think we're being a little bit too gloomy about it because we concentrate on physical borders in Ukraine. We haven't looked sufficiently, for example, at the enormous success Ukraine has had in dealing with the Russian Navy. And that will be a long war, and a very threatening one for all of us.
Indeed so. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, Sir Andrew Wood, former ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000. Well, coming up next, I'm going to be grilling Michael Tomlinson, the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, on the government's failure to stop the boats. Stay tuned.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney. Weekdays from 3 p.m.
Or they're trying to make it better, or they're trying to make it slower, a lot slower. Slower enough, in fact, for it to sufficiently allow the boats to start coming in to cause further political damage to Rishi Sunak.
Which it will do if it carries on.
Of course it will. And this is the Labour peers, the Lib Dem peers, and no doubt some of the Conservative wets, banding together, causing political damage to Rishi Sunak. And the longer it goes on, the worse it will be for the Conservative Party.
There's now a deadline on the Rwanda plan. It's got to start working this summer to have any electoral benefit for Rishi Sunak, because of course the election is in November. By then the costings will slow down. It's got to be up and running by about May or June, and then they'll take it from there.
Cool. And you have a crumb of comfort for us. Rishi Sunak met a Prime Minister.
Well, a crumb of comfort for those who want to stop the boat, certainly, or we'll get towards it. The PM today met Alexander De Croo, who's a Belgian Prime Minister. They've agreed a UK-Belgium law enforcement cooperation agreement. In short, that is a focus on surveillance and information, ultimately, which should help stop the boats. Not many boats make crossings from Belgium, but it's the kind of, they can hopefully use law enforcement. These are the kind of deals which Sir Keir Starmer's talking about. If he becomes Prime Minister, he'll do more of these deals with countries on the continent, and this shows that the PM, the Tory PM, can do them too.
And there may be intelligence sharing of crime gangs that operate within Belgium. As you say, it's a much, much further distance, much more perilous across the North Sea. Very unlikely that people will be leaving in any great numbers from Belgium. But nevertheless, is this of note, or is it a token victory against the backdrop of domestic loss?
They can do it with Belgium and not do it with the European Union, because so far we've been told the returns agreements can't be agreed with individual countries because they've got the European Union to talk to. Maybe this deal can be mirrored with France, and that might help with better cooperation, because basically after Brexit we're a sovereign country. We have to work on some areas more closely with our European neighbours.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Don't forget that very shortly I'm going to be joined by that former top cop, David Murray-Gilwoodson, to discuss the increasingly dire state of British policing and why the force is so bad at rooting out the bad apples in its ranks. But first of all, I'm delighted to be joined now by the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson. He's also the Tory MP for Mid Dorset and North Poole. Lovely to see you this morning, Mr Tomlinson. First of all, can I ask you about the death of Alexei Navalny? His family are saying this was orchestrated murder. Do you agree with that assessment?
May I say at the outset that Alexei Navalny was a courageous politician, somebody who stood up against Putin. If you think about, if we think that politics is difficult in the West, how much harder was it for Alexei Navalny to be standing up to Putin? And obviously my sympathy goes out to his wife and family and to all the Russian people. And I think the Foreign Secretary has been very clear on this, laying the blame firmly at Putin's door. He was absolutely right to do so, and I join him in doing it.
So orchestrated murder then?
I agree with the Foreign Secretary that the blame is firmly at Putin's door.
When Lord Cameron's talked about consequences for the Russian president, what sort of consequences can we expect to see?
Well, we've already seen, for example, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that there have been 1,700 individuals and entities who have been sanctioned. We know that that has had an effect because Putin himself has accepted the difficulties that those have presented. Clearly, that is an option for the Foreign Secretary to look at, and I'm sure he'll have the time and the space to do that. But more broadly, I think you can see from our support for the people of Ukraine, you may have seen overnight, the extension of the visa scheme for our Ukrainian friends who are over here seeking shelter and refuge in the United Kingdom. They now have the security and knowledge that they can be in the United Kingdom for a further 18 months. It was important to give them that certainty, and I think our broader support for Ukraine has been second to none.
Let's ask you about your brief as the Minister for Illegal Migration. I was quite surprised in the week to see a graph by the Oxford Migration Observatory suggesting that only 1.3% of those who have come here by boat illegally since 2018 have actually been removed from the country. That suggests that your policy on stopping illegal immigration has failed, and it's failed badly.
Well, let's look at that. Last year, boat crossings were down by 36%. 16,000 fewer people got in and made those dangerous crossings coming over. Of course, there is more to do. I was in France 48 hours ago seeing the work that was going on with our French counterparts, our French allies in this, and it's a joint mission. It is a joint endeavour stopping the boats between the French and the United Kingdom.
To only remove 1.3% of those coming here illegally, that is woeful. 1.3%. What message is that sending out to the people smugglers and indeed the people getting into barely inflatable dinghies? It's basically saying that almost 100% of you are going to end up being able to stay in the UK.
Camilla, I accept that there's more that needs to be done. You mentioned the flimsiness of the dinghies. Since the very first day in my office, I've been making the moral case for our Rwanda scheme. There have been many critics of it, many people saying that it wouldn't work or that it's not good enough. We have a moral imperative to make sure that people don't get on those boats. For the last 3 months, we have seen fatalities in the Channel. These people smugglers do not care if you're going to live or if you're going to die. They care about the bottom line. They care about profit. profit. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important, and we see that back in the House of Lords tomorrow. We need to get that on the statute book. I'm sure you'll see some parliamentary ping-pong between the House of Lords and the House of Commons when amendments are inevitably
I know,
going to be
but to
tabled
only
and
remove 1.3%, Mr Tomlinson. 1.3%.
Well, Camilla, I'm telling you about what we're doing to increase that, because we need to get these planes off the ground. I'm hearing that message loud and clear. But in order to do that, and in direct response to the Supreme Court judgments of the 15th of November, we need to get the treaty in place. That was signed on the 5th of December. We need to get the treaty ratified. We need to get this bill through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and we need to get those planes off the ground. And that's my mission.
Can you clear something up for us? Because the Telegraph had reported that when you were Solicitor General, you advised that ignoring Strasbourg injunctions to block flights would be in breach of ECHR. So do you actually think this Rwanda policy is legal?
You wouldn't expect me to comment on legal advice, but what you would expect me to do is to say what I will do as Minister and what the Prime Minister has said he will do. The Prime Minister has been very clear that he will not let a foreign court block our Rwanda plan. I'm very clear that the legislation in Clause 5, it's there in the statute, when we get it onto the statute books, says that it's for a minister to decide. That is fundamental. That's why we need the law to be on the statute book. And when that law is on the statute book, that's when decisions will be made and the planes will get off the ground.
But aren't the disastrous by-election results for the Tories reflective of the fact that the public looks at the 5-point plan and has decided it's not working? You know, the plan on the economy isn't working. We went into recession. The plan on stopping the boats isn't working because you haven't stopped them, and we now find out that you've only removed 1.3% of those who came here legally. So, I mean, you are in dire trouble. The plan's not working, Mr Tomlinson.
Well, Camilla, let me take those in turn. You've mentioned three things. In relation to the by-election, there is no doubt that the by-election was set against a very difficult backdrop. One message that I have received from the by-election, loud and clear, is that if you vote for reform, you get Labour. You go back to square one with Labour. So
maybe you have to do a deal with reform then, Mr Tomlinson.
No, the message is loud and clear. A vote for reform is going back to square one and you get Labour. So that's the first thing you mentioned. The second thing you mentioned was the economy. In relation to the economy, we have seen the Prime Minister's top priority was to halve inflation. Inflation was at 11.1%, don't forget. I'm sure you'll remember it was 11.1%. It's now down at 4%. We need to see growth improving. One of the biggest blocks to growth is inflation. That is...
The other thing that's down, Mr Tomlinson, is our living standards. I mean, maybe some people actually look on the last 14 years and say, we wouldn't mind going back to square one because we're in no better position now, 14 years on.
No, that's not right. If you look at the forecasters, if you look at the IMF that forecasts that we are going to grow as an economy faster than France, faster than Germany, faster than Italy, faster than Japan. If you look at the OECD, if you look at the Bank of England and the OBR, they all say that there will be growth and that is coming. We need to stick to the plan. But the final piece of the jigsaw you mentioned was firmly in my brief. That was the Prime Minister's plan and is the Prime Minister's plan to stop the boats. That is something that's been given to me. The Prime Minister has given that to me to deal with. I was in France 48 hours ago. That is our mission, and I'm very clear that we absolutely must and will stop the boats.
OK. Mr Tomlinson, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning.
Camilla, thank you.
Up next, we're going to be getting the reaction live from our People's panel in Nottingham. Very intrigued to see what they made particularly of that interview. Don't go anywhere.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Lots of people have different ideas, but principally a conservative approach to getting growth is to reduce taxes so that people, ordinary people and businesses can spend more of their own money to invest and grow the economy.
So the theory is that you cut taxes
and that then pumps more money into the economy.
Exactly right.
Growth.
And then people, it's not government that are creating wealth. It's individuals, businessmen, companies that create wealth. It's the private sector that creates wealth, that the public sector then taxes and spends.
I get the theory, but one of the criticisms of you, and I think one of the criticisms actually of all political parties, is they appear to be incapable of cutting government spending.
That's the key. I mean, and I think when I look back, is that we should have had a credible plan to reduce the increase in spending. Now, that's often a difficult concept to explain,
but it's in line with inflation, etc.
That's all right. So when you're slowing the increase, it means 1 year you spend £100, and the next year you spend maybe £101, as opposed to going up to £110. So the actual level isn't going down, but you're slowing the increase, and that's very much what I tried to do. And actually, looking back, the one thing I wish I'd done, was to present a credible spending plan at the same time as the tax cuts that we announced.
You had a go, it didn't work out for whatever reason, and that analysis will go on for some years to come. We have Jeremy Hunt there as Chancellor now, hinting quite strongly now there won't be any tax cuts, but the truth of it is, under 14 years of Conservatives, for a variety of reasons, the tax burden has risen.
That's right.
To the highest since the Attlee government, way back in
80 years,
1951, whatever it is.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. I'll be speaking to that former Scotland Yard top cop in just a moment about what's gone wrong with the police. But first of all, let's go back to Nottingham and find out from Will what the People's panellists have made of my interviews today.
Camilla, a fantastic programme as always. We haven't stopped speaking about it this morning in Nottingham. Michael McKeever, you're a retired head teacher. Lots to go off, but what did you take away from what you heard today on Camilla's programme?
Very disappointed to listen again to politicians not answering questions, first of all. Also to think on a sadder, kind of more global scale, that talking about Gaza and Russia, what worries me is the apparent impotence of the West to do anything about it. And at the same time, we've got this immense sadness at the death of Alex Navalny, and I feel sorry for the Russian people. It's kind of an extinction of hope for them, and that's the worrying thing I take away from this morning.
Michael, looking at the bigger picture, but here we are in Britain, a small island nation. Catherine, you're a landlady. You came into this thinking about illegal migration. What did you hear from the illegal immigration minister?
Well, nothing really different to what we were expecting. 1.3% have been returned back. We need to deal with things at France. That's the only point that we need to deal with. Everybody's getting over here, so we really, really need to work hard with France to stop the illegal boats, because there's people dying at the end of the day, and it's not fair for those that are coming over, and we're just housing everybody. And earlier on we said about the veterans, we need to consider veterans as well for homes, so let's start looking at the veterans over here for homes more than anything.
Looking after Brits by building a better relationship with France. Jeff, you work with veterans, you're a veteran yourself, but you're also a Labour supporter. We've had the Shadow Minister on today. What do you think of Labour? How well are they doing? In the build-up to a general election, they've had 2 big by-election wins in the last week.
I think they're doing a fantastic job. Having met Sir Keir personally, great guy, very sincere in what he's doing, and I'm sure he will sort anti-Semitism and everything out, and Labour will win the next election. Our local candidate in Bassetlaw, Councillor Jo White, is doing very, very well. She's a workaholic. She's always on the streets, knocking on doors, getting things done for Bassetlaw.
And that's in the Red Wall Bassett law. The Red Wall, Nottinghamshire and the Midlands, went to the Conservatives in 2019. But Jeff, a Labour supporter, is really hopeful that they'll get back in again. But when is that election coming? Well, I can guarantee you one thing, Camilla, that we'll be here talking about it on the People's Panel every Sunday morning when that election does come around.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the People's panellists. Don't forget, if you want to have your say, you can email us to apply to the People's Panel. It's peoplespanel@gbnews.uk. Couldn't be easier. Now, let's go on to my fellow presenter panellist, former Defence Secretary and GB News host Michael Portillo, to ask him, Michael, what's coming up on the show today?
Camilla, good morning and congratulations on your show. Well, Max Jeffrey has been writing in The Spectator. He's just got back from Estonia, where NATO has been conducting some exercises. Some of our allies in NATO now are quite worried that they may be the next ones to be attacked by Russia, and I'll be hearing how well those exercises have gone, how well coordinated NATO has been. That debate that we've had about whether the countryside is a white preserve and colonial, I want to go from there to asking a broader question, really. Should new arrivals to Britain be people for whom we have to adapt Britain, or should people arrive newly into Britain be adapting to the country? So that's a fairly broad ethical debate. As usual, we'll be talking about theatre. We're going to be reviewing 4 shows. Yesterday, I went along to the Old Vic and saw a theatre production which is about the Live Aid event back in, what was it, 1985, Bob Geldof and all of that, which is a very entertaining show, not entirely a perfect show, but a pretty entertaining one. And you know that we like to talk about food. Someone is going to be coming in from Italy and bringing in some truffles. And I imagine that these truffles have been rooted out by a dog somewhere in Italy. And we look forward to finding out what is so important about this exclusive and elusive fungus.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. I love that you always get to taste food on your show, which is something we don't do, but we'll tune in from 11 for all of that. Don't forget, in just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to former Scotland Yard top cop David Murray-Gilbertson about the state of the police. But first, here's a quick weather bulletin.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to today, it's certainly going to be the best day of the weekend. After any early rain clears the southeast, most of us seeing some decent sunshine. So we can see the area of rain across southeastern England. Some heavy rain still around, but that will clear towards lunchtime. And then for most of us, it is a drier and brighter picture. Still the risk of some showers, especially across more western parts of the country, but in between there will be some decent sunshine, especially into the afternoon across many eastern parts. And for all, it will be another mild day, temperatures in the south reaching 15 or 16 degrees. As we move into Sunday evening, for many we start off relatively dry with some clear skies, but then later on this band of rain reaches Northern Ireland and Scotland. That continues to move its way a little bit further eastwards as we go into small hours on Monday. Some heavy rain on it, especially as it moves into parts of northwest England, but for all of us it is staying mild. Temperatures at lowest probably around 5 to 6 degrees in the north. So that rain will continue to work its way eastwards as we move into Monday morning. It starts to weaken a little bit as it heads towards southeast England, so not a lot of rain left on it here. And then behind it, lots of sunshine around. A few showers in places, but I think for most it's going to be a decent day until some further cloud and rain arrives later up towards the far northwest of Scotland.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm joined now by retired Scotland Yard Deputy Assistant Commissioner David Murray-Gilbertson. He's the author of this book, The Strange Death of Constable George Dixon. And he joins me now to discuss, David, the state of the British police. I mean, I know you've said a lot about it in this book. Let's just start with something that I raised with Tobias Ellwood, who you'll know had his house besieged by pro-Palestinian protesters last week. What do you make of the fact that there are no arrests, that the police are allowing these protests to continue? I had the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in here a couple of weeks ago saying the police have the powers to stop this, they just don't use them.
It's what I say throughout my book. It's what I've said for years. It's a function of absolutely appalling leadership.
Right.
when you consider that the vast majority of officers on the street these days, male and female, have probably got less than 5 years' service. The vast majority have just come from school or straight into the police service. They have no experience of life generally. You can't expect them to make really quite far-reaching decisions on technical issues without leadership. There is no leadership.
I mean, when you say that, are you referring specifically to Mark Rowley, the head of the Met? Are you referring in general to management in the police force?
I'm not referring to Mark Rowley in particular at all. I've got a lot of time for him, actually. No, I'm talking about the leadership cadre in the police service as a whole. There are 43 police forces in England and Wales, and we've got a situation where we've got a tremendous amount of really good managers, but not too many leaders. And there's a difference between leadership and management.
And do you think that's a result of perhaps a more lax approach to recruitment? I mean, back in the day, you'd have top cops being university educated, you know, real achievers, real intellectual titans. And at the same time now, it seems, and we've seen reports about this, I know my own paper, The Telegraph, have reported that the standards have really dropped for people coming into the police force.
The standards in recruitment to police service at the moment are they're below rock bottom.
Well, what does that mean in
Well, I mean,
practice?
you've got a situation, for instance, in 2022, Her Majesty's Inspectorate did a major review of recruitment. Something like about 10% of the recruits to the Met at the time of the inspection, were functionally illiterate in English. Functionally illiterate. And that was because of the fact that ethnic minority targets were the primary issue for them. And they were making allowances to ensure that they could meet those targets. You cannot have a situation where you've got recruits who actually are passing through the system onto the streets who can't read and write English.
No.
Take aside from that the issue of, again, the leadership cadre, and that's a big issue for me, leadership in the service. The graduate entry scheme in the police was abandoned in 2004. Completely abandoned.
Why?
And it's been replaced by an alphabet soup of different systems for recruiting to the police service, which really don't deliver. They do not deliver. My big thing about policing, and I mean, I was 35 years in the police service. I was proud to be a member of the police. I don't admit to being that now.
Really? What? Because you're ashamed?
It disappoints me. I feel ashamed of the way things have gone.
But that's such a sorry state of affairs.
It's a sorry state for me. I've got two sons who wouldn't have anything to do with the police service.
When we look at the managerial problems, I mean, on one hand, I think that most people would support the idea of having a diverse police force, not least because the police have to deal with people of all different backgrounds and ethnic minorities, white people, black people, Asian people, and all the rest of it. So we get that. We want to see the British public reflected in the police force. But at the same time, do you think that there's been a bit too much focus on sort of woke policies? We had Suella Braverman also accusing the police during the pro-Palestinian marches of playing favourites. I mean, do you think that's the case? Is the management of the police force too left-wing?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think the problem is, I go back to it, if you've got police officers actually at the cutting edge who are dealing with demonstrators, the vast majority of them don't actually understand the cultural, the political, the historical issues involved. As I say, they are poorly educated, they are poorly trained, but most of all, they are poorly led. What the public at large in this country want is a police service that will protect them and their families from harm. They don't want to be their friends. They don't want to know the name of the local police officer. If there's an issue and the police have to attend, they want somebody to attend who has the powers to deal with their problem and who can deal with them promptly. They're not getting that at the moment. In many parts of the country, and I choose my words very carefully, police officers at the cutting edge are shaven-headed, tattooed thugs. And it's disappointing. It's disappointing.
Really?
Yes, really.
OK, so let's take it from a different perspective, because the police, in their defence, and let's be honest, they're not here to defend themselves, I think they would argue that their budgets and resources have been cut significantly over the course of the last 2 decades, that they're down in numbers, and that's why we don't see that kind of visible bobbies on the beat that we used to back in the day.
Right, bobbies on the beat has been a mantra that has been employed for years. There haven't been bobbies on beats for the last 2 decades. And it hasn't been because of resources, it's been because of the need to ensure that the performance targets are met. And one of the difficulties is if you measure the police service on the basis of the bottom line, it's very difficult to prove what value a police officer walking down the high street at 3 o'clock in the morning does. Well, you know, how many crimes has he committed? I don't know how many crimes he's prevented.
I know, but then that lack of visibility, I think, seems to give people carte blanche to do what they like.
But
I mean, just take Rolex thefts, or these people that are going into shops and just stealing loads of gear and nobody's intervening, people who are burglarising homes and stealing stuff in general, and get your car nicked, your bike nicked. Police don't do anything.
No.
I mean, it's created an environment where criminals think they can prosper and not be sent down.
Absolutely. But what does the public want? The public want visibility, and they want officers who can deal with the problems promptly. That isn't happening. There is no visibility. There is not in any real sense.
OK, well, let's talk about solutions then, because you've highlighted a number of problems. What needs to happen, David?
Right. It's all, as in anything relating to public policy, there are 3 issues involved. It's funding, it's money, it's the quality of the leadership, and it's the art of the possible. The art of the possible is always political will. So you've got to have a situation where you have political leaders who are prepared to make a change, who are prepared to do something. That's in the gift of the electorate. I don't know. In terms of leadership, I do not believe that we have sufficient people either now or in the pipeline to meet the challenge. And the thing to do is to look outside the tent. There are plenty of people in industry, in commerce, in the world at large, even abroad, who could lead the police service in this country and lead it well. As I said just now, we've got lots and lots of good managers. We haven't got too many leaders.
Yeah.
And the last thing is money, because the issue around money is not as bad as you think.
OK, so could have more funding, but it's not the key issue.
It's not the key issue. It's a good excuse.
David, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. I'm going to be back at 9:30 next Sunday. Michael Portillo is up next. He's going to be talking about all sorts of things and tasting food, so that's nice. And if you missed any of the show today, don't forget you can catch up on the highlights at 6 p.m. here on GB News. Enjoy your rest of your Sunday.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake, civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
But I'm all right with people roll, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
But do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying